event of the University of San Francisco Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice lecture. We have a full calendar of events, and this is the first one of the academic year. Tonight we will hear from Dr. Penny Rosenwasser as she speaks about her new book, Hope into Practice. Founded in 2008, the USF Jewish Studies and Social Justice program is the first and only program of its kind, in the history of the United States, formally linking Jewish studies with social justice. In addition to offering numerous courses related to this interdisciplinary field, our program offers a minor in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. We call it JSSJ here in the program, as well as an annual speaker series related to Jewish identities, an annual social justice lecture delivered each spring, and an annual social justice Passover Seder, which you're all invited to all of these things. In addition, in partnership with a number of different Bay Area-based organizations like the Jewish Community Center of San Francisco, as well as countless synagogues and mosques, we also offer unique educational programs related to ways to end and transform ethnic and national conflicts, such as Beyond Bridges Israel-Palestine program, which is a summer program in Israel and Palestine. This fall, in addition to tonight's exciting event, we're bringing renowned author and artist Rebecca Walker to campus on Tuesday, September 30th, where she will speak about being Black, white, and Jewish, as well as Dr. Joy Layden on Tuesday, October 9th. She will speak about the genesis of gender, looking at creation narratives found in the biblical book of Genesis and how it connects to the construction of gender today. More information about both of these, or all of these events, can be found at a flyer on the table right outside. Also, if you're interested in getting on the JSSJ listserv, there's a sign-up sheet on one of the papers outside. Let us put down your email, and we'll send you emails about all the amazing events we have. Yes, they are amazing. And now let us begin tonight's program officially. According to various traditions, from as far back as the Garden of Eden, human beings have been grappling with ideas such as right and wrong, justice and injustice, and responsibility. From Adam and Eve to the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, these issues continue to play a central role in many of our lives today, whether in San Francisco or Cairo, New York City, or Jerusalem. For Heschel, one of the greatest modern-day prophets of the contemporary Jewish world, social justice is about balancing the tension between one's individual identity and community identity. In his own words, a central concern in Jewish thinking is to overcome the tendency to see the world in one dimension, from one perspective, to reduce history exclusively to God's actions or to man's actions, either to grace or to man's initiatives. The marvelous and the mundane, the sacred and the secular, are not mutually exclusive, nor are the natural and the supernatural, the temporal and the eternal, kept apart. The heart of the relationship of God and man is reciprocity, interdependence. The task is to humanize the sacred and to sanctify the secular. With this in mind, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Penny Rosenwasser. In addition to her newest book, Hope into Practice, Dr. Penny Rosenwasser is the author of Visionary Voices, Women on Power, Conversations with Shamans, Activists, Teachers, Artists, and Healers, and Voices from a Promised Land, Palestinian and Israeli peace activists speak their hearts. A lifelong, heartfelt rebel-rouser for justice, she earned her PhD at the California Institute of Integral Studies here in San Francisco in Transformational Learning and Change. Dr. Rosenwasser is former Jewish Caucus Chair of the National Women's Studies Association and a founding board member of Jewish Voice for Peace. She teaches an anti-Semitism, anti-Arabism class with a Palestinian colleague at the City College of San Francisco and belongs to Kehila Synagogue in Oakland. After hearing from Dr. Rosenwasser, we'll have an opportunity to open up the floor for questions and either answers or more questions. So please join me in welcoming Penny.
What an introduction. Thank you, Oren. You all are really lucky to have him. He's quite a fantastic scholar and activist in his own right. So, and has worked really hard to set this up for me to come. So, thank you. And also, I wanted to thank all the sponsors and co-sponsors, the Swig program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, the Theology and Religious Studies Department, International Studies, the Master's Program in International Studies, and programs in Middle East Studies and Peace and Justice Studies. That's a formidable group. I know that this event has been advertised as being about activism in Israel and Palestine, and that is partly what it's about, and how that connects to internalized anti-Semitism and how we feel about ourselves as Jews, and what our struggles are. And I'm also going to be talking about working for justice in general, working for a kinder, gentler world that's more equal, where everyone has an equal access to resources. And then it's a lot about, my book is a lot about what I call human liberation. And if you don't know what that is, hopefully by the time I finish, you'll have a better idea. And if not, we can talk about it. And it's not like there's one way to think about it, but this is the way that I think about it. And when I'm finished, as Oren says, we can do a Q&A, share our thoughts, ideas, etc., including if you want to talk at all about the recent Israeli attack on Gaza for 51 days, that you probably know killed 2,100 Palestinians, over 2,100, many of them civilians, most of them civilians, including 500 children, and killed about 70 Israelis, over 70 Israelis, most of them soldiers. And how that affects us is it was done with US tax dollars, and US arms were used. So I'll touch on that a little bit, but we can also talk more about that later because it's totally connected to everything I'm talking about. I'm assuming a lot of you are not Jewish. I'm glad you're here. I've been talking to audiences all over the country, and a lot of diverse groups have related a lot to what I'm talking about, so we'll see if you do. But at any rate, from what I'm saying today, I think you'll get some new understandings about the Jews in your life, and it'll help you to be better allies. I'm sure you're already great allies because you're already here. And today is the debut of the University of San Francisco Hope into Practice players, who are going to be reading excerpts from my book interspersed with my talk. And I think that it keeps things lively, but it also, the book is full of voices, mostly women's voices, some men, some trans voices. And so by hearing these folks read some of the readings, it'll give you a felt sense of the book. So now Oren and Sarah and Craig and Letitia, if you would come up and sit. Let's give these folks a hand for their courage. And before we get started, I'm actually just, this event is also about community building. If you would just take 30 seconds and turn to someone next to you and tell them why you're here. And I know some of you are here because you're getting extra credit or you had to come, but is there any other reason? So just go ahead, just turn to someone next to you and take 30 seconds and introduce yourself if you don't know each other. See, that wasn't so bad. Thanks for humoring me. I thought I would start off just by telling you a little bit of my own Jewish background, which starts with my granddaddy, Moshe Morris, who is very beloved to me. He's passed on now, but I call on him all the time when I need help or advice. So Moshe immigrated here when he was 12 years old from a little shtetl, or Jewish village in Poland, in an area called Galicia, that was southeastern Poland. And the year was 1900, and he came with his brother, who was a few years older. And they came escaping anti-Semitism and poverty. Their mother had just died. And they came through Ellis Island, New York, and Granddaddy got a job on the Lower East Side in a sweatshop, sweeping the floor of a necktie factory. And pretty soon he got promoted to sewing women's skirts. So he was doing this 12 hours a day, 5 days a week, so he couldn't go to school, but sometimes he could go to Hebrew school at night. And over the years, he gradually saved a little bit of money. So when a relative in South Carolina wrote to him and said, there's a really good job for you down here in the dry goods store, like a clothing store, you should come down. So he did. And pretty soon he bought his own clothing store. And this was in a little town called Denmark, South Carolina. His sister Annie actually pawned her wedding ring to help give him money to do that. And this is where he raised my mom and her 4 siblings. And they were one of 2 Jewish families in the whole town. And on Saturdays, Granddaddy would drive several hours. He'd drive his sons several hours round trip so they could go to Hebrew school. And on Sundays, he taught Bible study at the local Baptist church because he was the most learned Bible scholar in the town. Fast forward to the 1950s, which I'm sure sounds like eons ago to you, but it's actually was during my childhood. And this is where I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, and it was a very white, Christian, middle-class scene. And I remember people looking at me and saying, "Gee, Penny, you don't look Jewish." And I would shrug my shoulders and say, "Thank you," because that's what I thought I was supposed to say. And it was many, many years later that I remembered that story and felt understandably horrified. That I would say thank you when someone said, "You don't look Jewish." I mean, where was that coming from? I don't remember any overt anti-Semitism coming at me, but I think that's an indicator of the anti-Semitism that was in the air in those white, Christian, middle-class suburbs in the 1950s. And I was born 4 years to the day after the last death march left Auschwitz. We belonged to Temple Bethel Sunday School. It was a Reformed temple. I went every Sunday until I was 16. We had a Hanukkah menorah in our window, and we also had a Christmas tree. We celebrated Christmas because my parents wanted us to blend in and belong as American. I felt really uncomfortable in my Jewish skin. I wanted to be cool, like the Christian kids that were all around me. So if you read the book, you will find out how I actually worked to combat the effects of that assimilation. It was a powerful experience, and the good news is I have really reclaimed what I'd call a loud, proud sense of my Jewishness. I feel very happy to be Jewish. It's a wonderful part of my life experience, and I feel like my Jewishness really grounds my social justice work. Part of my process in reclaiming that really wonderful feeling about being Jewish was doing my dissertation on exploring, resisting, and healing from internalized anti-Semitism, an activist women's inquiry. And I recruited a group of 9 other Jewish women, and we met for a year. We met 1 day a month. And we talked about our stories and shared our stories with each other. And even though we were all in the Bay Area, we grew up in New York and LA and Chicago and Denver and Ohio and Washington, D.C. and Montreal. We had a 25-year age difference between 25 and 50. We had different class backgrounds. Some of us were Ashkenazi, most of us were Ashkenazi, a few were Mizrahi, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. We had different sexual orientations, those are the words we called it in those days. We had different relationships to our Jewishness, some very religious, some not at all. But as we shared our stories, we realized we had one thing in common, and that was that we all felt like there was something wrong with who we were as Jewish women, that we had some kind of personal pathology. As we kept talking and learning together and sharing our stories, we realized there was nothing wrong with us. The problem was the system of anti-Semitism and sexism and homophobia and racism and classism and ageism and ableism and whatever else I'm leaving out. The stories of these women were, this was a wild, unruly, soulful, very smart group. And their stories were so great, I didn't want them sitting in a PhD dissertation that no one would read. So that was the reason I put them in this book, Hope into Practice, Jewish Women Choosing Justice Despite Our Fears. So the book has those stories in it. It also has, it's some of my own personal trajectory. In second wave feminism, we learned the personal is political. And it also has analysis, like about what, from my perspective, anti-Semitism is and what it isn't. Also perspective about race and about power. I thought I'd just give you a little flavor of the book by reading a few of the chapters to you. There are books for sale here. After I'm finished, Oren will be able to sell any to you if you're interested. Or you can also get it at the library. And if your library doesn't have it, get them to order it. I would really appreciate that. So these are some of the chapter titles. Insider, Outsider, Jews, Race, and Privilege. Let's talk about Jewish power, rethinking stereotypes. Suckled on worry. Hello, assimilation, goodbye, persecution. There is a real Jewish woman, and I am not her. Push, push, push for perfection. Where do I belong? Cracking the code of our conditioning. The chapter on race, for example, insists on the centrality of Jewish multiculturalism, so the full inclusion of Jews of color, of Jews from Mizrahi countries, who are Mizrahi Jews, so that means Jews from countries in the Middle East who never left the Middle East, like Iraq, Tunisia, Yemen, Jordan, Syria. Also Sephardic Jews, Jews who originally were from Turkey, South America, Spain, Portugal, North Africa. Jews from India, Jews from Africa, Jews with multicultural or hyphenated identities. This is one of the voices in the book. Chinese-American Jew, Linda Jum wrote, "When I attend a Jewish event, people often feel entitled to ask me, 'So how are you Jewish?' My response depends on how cranky I might be that day, and will range from using this as a teachable moment to snapping back, 'You go first. How are you Jewish?'"
For white-ish Ashkenazi Jews, the homework includes changing dynamics of domination that center Ashkenazi experience as the Jewish experience. Rachel Wahba identifies as a Mizrahi, Sephardi, Middle Eastern, North African, Arab Jew. After immigrating to the States, she found herself having to explain, yes, I was a Jew, even though my parents were from Egypt and Iraq. Even though? Why is Yiddish created as more Jewish than Ladino or Judeo-Arabic? Or why is Wahba's Yom Kippur breakfast meal of baba filled with mashed dates not seen as Jewish as matzo ball soup? Iraqi Jew Lulwa Khazum points out, when we ignore, devalue, or cut off branches from our collective Jewish tree, we amputate a vital part of ourselves. Since European Jews come from non-European Jews, their oppression of non-European Jews is like hating your ancestors.
This is from Gen X writer April Rosenbloom.
Can you hear Sarah? Can you all hear her?
Should I stand up?
Yeah, why don't you stand up? Thanks.
Hey everyone. This is from Gen X writer April Rosenbloom. When white Jews have trouble confronting white privilege, it can look more attractive and less uncomfortable to make an issue of anti-Semitism. Sorry, it won't be possible to choose between the two. Anti-Jewish oppression cannot be dealt with in a movement that isn't also utterly dedicated to fighting the oppression of people of color. For those who aren't white Ashkenazi, this means non-stop awareness of privilege, catching that urge to run the show, to control because we know best, instead sliding over, stepping back, making room, always, for the voices of the less enfranchised, be they African American, Mexican, Palestine, Sephardi.
So the chapter on power explores the complexities of white Jewish success and structural advantage and privilege, and how this can be exaggerated into stereotypes of Jewish power. For example, Jewish prominence in Hollywood is not the same as Jewish control, because the culture of power in this country is predominantly Christian, as well as white and male. And also, the chapter talks about anti-Semitism can single out individual Jews, target individual Jews, that takes the heat off the class system. You know, that power elite that makes the decisions that affect our lives every day. And in that power elite, a small percentage of them are Jews, but the vast percentages are not Jewish, most of them Christian, and then folks from different ethnicities and religions as well. And also, not all Jews are affluent. I think that's obvious, but it's important to say. Significant numbers are poor or working class, especially young Jews, old Jews, immigrants, single parents. And then in terms of a lot of us as Jewish women activists, one of the problems is that we can internalize that stereotype of the powerful Jew, and so it can hold us back and make us sit on our hands because we don't want to be targeted that way, and that keeps our activism from being as powerful as it can be. This is one of my own stories. I remember when my less assimilated, gutsy, working-class Jewish friend Mel and I organized an Unlearning Anti-Semitism workshop for our staff colleagues at the Michigan Women's Music Festival. While Xeroxing handouts beforehand, Mel yelled across the courtyard, "Penny, how many more copies of the Jewish liberation piece do we need?" Right there in the sweet summer morning, surrounded by women who were family, I shrank into my Doc Martens, muscles tightening, blood draining from my face. Oh my goddess, are they rolling their eyes about those loud, pushy Jews, I worried. We should be quieter. Then, Melanie K. Kantrowitz's words floated before me. Someone will always call us pushy. Isn't it time to really push? I breathed again. Yep, it's time. So the last chapter of the book is called Choosing Justice Despite Our Fears, and it really advocates for changing unfair systems. I'm a member of Kehillah Synagogue in Oakland, and my rabbi, David J. Cooper, wrote, "How do we manage spiritually during hard times? The most subversive thing that a synagogue or community organization can do is to affirm the problems lie not with ourselves, but with the system that is more concerned with short-term gain than with people and with the health of the planet." And this chapter also calls for changing US policies regarding Israel and Palestine. It calls for human rights, security, dignity, and equality for Palestinians, as well as for Israelis. It calls for lifting the siege of Gaza, and it calls for an end to the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. In his 2011 Kol Nidre sermon, Rabbi David wrote, he named Israel-Palestine the single greatest ethical issue facing the Jewish people in the 21st century. So overall, this book, it's about Jewish women and trans folks, but it's really, like I was saying at the beginning, it's really for anyone who cares about human liberation. It's about linking personal healing with social justice. And the bottom line is, if I feel better about who I am, I'm going to treat other people better, my life is going to be bigger and more full of possibility, and my activism for a better world is going to be more effective. And then for those of us who are Jews, it also is about having the courage to face our fears, but not to act on them, so that we're choosing justice despite our fears. And we're linking the healing from internalized anti-Semitism to working for the liberation of Jews, and the liberation of Palestinians, and the liberation of all people. So when I'm talking about internalized oppression, you might say, what is she talking about? There's a spiritual teacher named Sally Kempton, and she says, it's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. It's hard to fight an enemy who has outposts in your head. You know, those toxic messages that I think a lot of us have that tell us there's something wrong with who we are. And so for Jews in this country, a lot of those messages come from a Christian dominant society that tell us that we're not Christian enough. We're too Jewish. For those of us who are Jewish women or genderqueer, it might be we're too loud, we're too pushy, we're too dark, we're too intense, we're too exuberant, we're too difficult, we're too needy, blah, blah, blah. You could fill in a lot of blanks. This is another story. This is one of the women in the book, Ronnie. That's what I call her. These are all pseudonyms. And she has both Ashkenazi and Mizrahi heritage. And Ronnie says, I was just visiting my family and I was on the phone with my WASP girlfriend. She heard my family in the background. And she asked, oh my God, why are they screaming at each other? Ronnie grinned. They're talking. That's the way they talk. And this isn't even the Iraqi side, who are louder. So internalized anti-Semitism, there's a lot of ways it can manifest, and we can talk about that later too, but a couple I wanted to bring up here. In a lot of our Jewish families, we learn to be very critical of each other and very critical of ourselves. And I think where that comes from is the idea that if we're critical of each other, we can get each other to shape up so we won't screw up, so we won't get blamed. Worst case scenario, so we won't get killed. That's historically how anti-Semitism played out, intermittently, not all the time. Similar, a lot of us feel this need to control everything around us. The idea that if we can control everything, nothing will go wrong, and we won't get in trouble, and bad things won't happen. Here's one that I think is true for any marginalized group. As women, queer, disabled, working class, a member of any of those groups. If you see a member of your group and their behavior makes you cringe, you go, ugh, get me away from that person. That could be a heads up about your own internalized oppression. I'll give you one example I have, which is I, in the past, and still a little bit, but less so, get very triggered by Jewish women who are really competitive, very overtly competitive, and doing things, and I just go, ugh, get her away from me. Ugh, you know, it really would make my skin crawl. Until upon examination, I realized I had that same stuff. I had those same competitive voices in me. I was thinking I was hiding them. I have no idea if I was hiding them or not. But once I realized I had the same stuff, it didn't trigger me so much in someone else. And in fact, I could have compassion for her and kind of have a sense of humor about it. So that's been really helpful. That's just something to consider. Greg.
Right. And even though different marginalized groups each have distinct experiences, we sometimes have similar internalized messages, like feeling not Chicana enough if they don't know Spanish, or feeling too black or not black enough. My colleague who was viciously targeted in school after 9/11 admitted, I say that I'm Middle Eastern, I can't say Arab. The racial slurs are embedded in me. I'm afraid that they're true. Yet change is possible. During the 2011 victory celebrations in Cairo's Tahrir Square, after President Mubarak was ousted, how moving to see activists proclaim with jubilant faces, finally, I'm proud to be Egyptian.
Speaking to the excruciating struggle for women overall, Gloria Steinem reiterates how U.S. white patriarchal culture promotes thinness instead of individuality and health. Rabbi Harold Kushner injects the role of capitalism. Entire industries, fashion, cosmetics, low-calorie foods, diet books, weight loss clinics have been built on the foundation of women's feeling ashamed of their appearance, to the point where one could speculate that if all women were to wake up one morning feeling good about themselves, the economy would collapse.
So internalized anti-Semitism is also about behaviors that get passed through our families in response to historic persecution. From the Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms. Pogroms were state-sponsored riots that killed hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe, to the Nazi Holocaust, which killed 2/3 of the Jews in the world. So a lot of us today still have some kind of fear for our safety. And we might not be aware that we have that fear, but we might worry a lot, or we might feel anxious. As I said earlier, we might be suckled on worry. That was one of the chapter titles. We might have a sense of hypervigilance, kind of always looking over our shoulder. We might feel a sense of urgency, a sense of panic. There's a gay Jewish men's group in San Francisco, and they took Bobby McFerrin's song, Don't Worry, Be Happy, only they sing, Don't Be Happy, Worry. We can turn that fear around, though. In our group, Emily was telling us about going to Germany to perform a concert for 2,000 people and coming out as a Jew on stage. She said, it's the scariest thing I've ever done. Oops, sorry about that. Should have turned my phones off. Come on. I'll start that over. We can turn that fear around. Emily was telling us about being a Jew in Germany and performing a concert for 2,000 people and coming out as a Jew on stage. She said, it's the scariest thing I've ever done. My grandparents couldn't fathom that I would go. But I could not be a Jew in Germany and not come out. And though my father instilled his own lack of safety in me, the work I'm doing is breaking that down. But you know, if we don't turn the fear around, it can freeze our thinking. It can warp our perspective. It can make us believe, as Jews, that what happened in the past is actually happening in the present. And this is what I call our internalized victimization. And it's kind of the core of the book. The chapter where I most talk about it is called Taking Egypt Out of the Jews. Because in the Passover Seder, there's a line that says it was not enough to take the Jews out of Egypt. We had to take Egypt out of the Jews. And I'm not talking about Egyptian Jews here. Because of the ways that Jews have been historically hurt, attacked, exiled, raped, murdered, excluded, there is a lot of grief and trauma and pain and fear that gets passed through our families until we're able to work through it and heal it. And the irony is that for those of us who are white Ashkenazi Jews, we, on the outside, we look very privileged, and a lot of us are very privileged. But on the inside, there's often a lot of vulnerability and insecurity that you can't see. I learned from my friends who were in the domestic violence movement this adage, and it's hurt people, hurt people. Hurt people, hurt people. It's the idea that any group who's been traumatized, if we don't work through that trauma, we can project it onto another group that we've been taught to hate or fear, like Palestinians, like Muslims. I think this is a lot of the dynamic that's going on right now in Israel and in this country in terms of Islamophobia.
Our fear ripples out onto those who were not the ones who shipped us to camps, or shot us in shtetls, or torched us in medieval synagogues. This is not our fault, but it's simply not acceptable. We can do better. As horrendous as Jews' experience was, it didn't catapult us into exalted status. We are not the only peoples who have suffered, who feel vulnerable. Emily talked about Jews giving up the badge of victim. That's our history. But how do we move on? Is that what I want to pass on to my daughter, to me? It's not disowning what the wounds have been, but it's also figuring out how to walk better in the world without victimization and shame.
And then I think what's really important is noticing how our Jewish trauma gets manipulated by leaders. Some of them Jewish, some of them not, some of them in this country, some of them in Israel, to serve their own political agendas. Like it serves them to keep us afraid. An example, this is not regarding Jews per se, but if any of you remember after 9/11, when George Bush said, "You're either with us or you're against us," he was trying to whip up fear in this country to authorize him to bomb Afghanistan. That's the dynamic I'm talking about. And not meaning to be overly rhetorical here, but I think it's in the interest of US imperialism to keep Jews afraid, to manipulate support for a militarized Israel, because that translates to selling US arms, establishing US hegemony in the Middle East with access to Middle East resources. Some of you might know that the US sends more aid to Israel than to any other country. It's over $3 billion a year. But what you might not know is that 75% of that has to be spent on US corporations, and most of them are arms dealers. For example, with the recent Israeli attack on Gaza, as I was saying earlier, it killed over 2,100 Palestinians. 500 of them were children. Those were US arms that Israel used. They were, I looked it up, they were Hellfire missiles, F-16 fighter jets, Apache helicopters that were specifically attack helicopters, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and bombs.
When we are afraid, we are most vulnerable to laying aside our moral compass, especially if we are made to feel that our lives are at stake. Some leaders manipulate Holocaust wounds until Jews believe catastrophe could happen at any moment. No wonder so many people support disproportionate force when told they are under attack, even from leaders whose weapons are negligible. The message of the Torah, says Rabbi Michael Lerner, is that the chain of pain can be broken, that we do not have to pass on to others what has been done to us.
A friend of mine who's a scholar at Barnard College, she teaches women's studies and Yiddish, and her name is Irina Klepvich. And Irina escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II, where many, many hundreds of thousands of Jews died. She escaped when she was 4 years old with her mother. And her father led a very famous uprising there called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising against the Nazis for 3 weeks, and he died leading that uprising. And Irina has worked very hard to end the Israeli occupation, and she writes, my Jewish fears remind me that I have not left the tribe. I need to convince others of what I have to convince myself again and again, that we must choose justice despite our fears, that our fears are real, rooted in history, but they can't stop us from making just choices. And then she goes on to talk about how unhealed fear can confuse Jews into placing the Nazi Holocaust into the center of our identity, so that that's how we identify as Jews. And she says we need to recontextualize the Holocaust so that it informs who we are, but it doesn't define who we are. And I think that's really profound. And then these are my words. We need to face the Israeli government's refusal to dismantle settlements, to end the occupation, to lift the siege of Gaza, to grant Palestinians democratic rights. We need to build a movement to push our government hard to pressure Israel to implement these goals. Not allowing fear to derail us, we remember that silence equals consent. When AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League and Jewish federations press for misguided US policies that support subjugating Palestinians, our speaking out for Palestinian rights as visible Jews has an impact far beyond our numbers. And that's why I work with an organization called Jewish Voice for Peace. We're national, but we were started right in Oakland, California. There's some literature on the table if you're interested. It's for Jews, but it's also for allies. You can go to jvp.org and look us up. And the short version is that we just say that Palestinians as well as Israelis deserve human rights and equality, and that all lives are equally precious. I think that's kind of boiling everything down. And then I just wanted to reiterate, it's not our fault as Jews that we have a lot of this fear and trauma, but I do think it's our responsibility to heal it and to stop projecting Jewish trauma from the past onto Palestinians.
And April Rosenblum points out, you keep things clear when you describe actions and policies as unjust, not people or nations. For example, distinguishing between the accuracy of the statement, the Israeli government systematically confiscates Palestinian land, from the anti-Jewish idea that Israel is the root of the world's problems. Let's pay attention when criticism of Israel takes on a special tone of hatred and contempt that draws on the same poisoned well as attacking Jewish slumlords as Jews, or singling out the Jewishness of one group of developers while never mentioning the religion of the many Christian developers.
So I'm going to take a pause now because I've been talking about a lot of intense stuff. And I'm going to ask you to turn to someone again, and you'll each just have 1 minute to share any ideas going on in your head, any feelings you're having, or anything you want to share with that person. And so for the first person, take a minute, and then I'll tell you when to switch. And thank you once again for doing that. So now we're going to hear some more from different sections of the book.
Right. Speaking to the theme of perfection and how good do we have to be, Rabbi Harold Kushner points to studies showing that athletes who obsess over their mistakes do much worse than athletes who say to themselves, that wasn't very good, the next one will be better. They refuse to let one play define their self-worth. He says the question is not whether we will sometimes get some important things wrong and feel terrible about it. The question is, how shall we deal with our sense of inadequacy? It ought to be with relief that we realize that we never will be perfect. When you do wrong, realize that it was because the challenge of being human is so great that no one gets it right every time.
If I've accomplished something, it doesn't mean that I can stop moving. Dina sighed. As Jews, we have to keep on going, so we always have something to show, to make ourselves valid, as an excuse for being present. That smacks of Holocaust mentality, mused Reedy, the grandchild of a Shoah survivor. Or even before that, Ellie added, surviving shtetls, pogroms, because my world is so exclusively what I do, especially for others, rather than just who I am. The minute I am no longer needed, I am no longer wanted. My utility is all that matters. The association I just had in terms of survival and the Holocaust was if you fell off of terms of work and you were dead. A friend tells a story of her Aunt Hannah in Auschwitz. When Hannah's niece Rivka, age 13, was in line for the gas chambers, Hadn't informed the guard. Rivka is a good worker. Is she relative, the guard asked. No, Hannah lied. Just a good worker. Rivka's life was spared.
I'm now in Iowa, showing slides of Israel and Palestine. Shira is president of the campus Zionist group, here because her religion professor assigned her class to come. Later, the teacher sends me Shira's paper, which reads, quote, I spent at least 2 of my 4 undergraduate years waging a propaganda war against a group of people I'd never actually spoken to or really even listened to. I spoke to a Palestinian man for the first time today. Our conversation was brief, but it meant everything in the world to me. I wonder if it meant anything to him. On my left, she continued, was a Jordanian student who had a constant stream of tears running down his face throughout the slideshow, revealing a truly tragic sadness. I was able to feel it with him for the first time tonight. I'm not sure why tonight was different from any other night, a familiar question in my tradition, but somehow it was. I suppose something just needs to click inside a person before they're able to see beyond their loyalties. I hope this is just the beginning for me of realizing that the Palestinians, by virtue of being human, are entitled to as much as any other group. And I especially hope that others can bring themselves to transcend their sacred bonds before they're faced with tragedies of their own. There's another book chapter I call Jewish Positive, and it's about how Jews have resisted persecution and how non-Jews have been allies to us and how we can be allies to other people as well. Sarah?
Okay, I'm here, I got this.
That's cool.
Did you know about visionary Dona Gracia Nassi? After failing to persuade the Pope to stop Portuguese Inquisition, she mobilized an underground railroad to help hundreds of Jews escape. And then during Shoah, one of the most courageous unsung heroes of the Jewish resistance was 19-year-old Rosa Robota. After seeing her own family march to the ovens, Rosa organized the smuggling that supplied dynamite that blew up the Auschwitz crematorium. Working in the camp munition factory for months, Rosa and her friends carried out little wheels of dynamite, which then hid in their bosoms or in the hems of their dresses. Our guide at Auschwitz said they smuggled that dynamite in their fingernails. After her capture and her friends were hanged, she shouted,
Hazak ve'hamatz.
Be strong and of good courage. Rosba,
Rozga Korchak.
one of the chief partisans of Vilna, described her companions. When I review the course of our work, I think constantly of the women. It was they who maintained contact between the ghetto and the city. Using false paper, though the penalty was instant death, it was they who spread the idea of resistance, who carried on the technical work in the ghetto and who later fought amongst the partisans. I want to tell you something about them. They were not extraordinary women with special training. We saw how human beings rose to the needed height in the daily execution of their tasks. Those girls had a daily heroism, and they had it.
When Esther Brown, a white Kansas Jew, hated the inferior education that her housekeeper's children were getting, she initiated the groundbreaking Brown versus Topeka Board of Education lawsuit, leading to the Supreme Court's 1954 decision outlining segregated schools. Undeterred by a cross burning on her lawn or her husband losing his job. And at San Francisco State University, when a Malcolm X mural was painted with dollar signs next to Jewish stars, African American professor Louis Lyles painted "Stop" on the mural. When she was subsequently arrested, she explained attributing anti-Semitism to Malcolm defamed his memory.
In July 2010, Special U.S. Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Hannah Rosenthal, was at a conference in Kazakhstan, along with U.S. Special Representative to Muslim Communities, Farah Anwar Pandit. To spice up their presentations, they exchanged prepared speeches. Pandit condemned anti-Semitism, while Rosenthal blasted Islamophobia. Israeli historian Tom Segev wrote, "It wasn't just a gimmick. Rosenthal believes that Jews cannot fight anti-Semitism by themselves, and Muslims cannot fight the hatred they experience by themselves. There is a need for a joint war against racism.
To create an alliance with her Arab Muslim friend Jamal, Terry Fletcher tells of her first visit to a mosque. Other Muslim friends lent her a hijab and long robe. Terry writes, "During a break in the prayers, I agreed to take my former student to a store down the street to buy some sweets. The errand seemed innocuous enough, but as we stepped onto the dark street, I realized with fright that I was walking around in public in full Muslim attire just 2 months after 9/11, when hate crimes against Muslims were rampant. Thankfully, nothing untoward happened, but walking that block to the store turned out to be far more terrifying than anything I experienced as a Jew." Terry is the daughter of a Shoah survivor. After Terry's mosque visit, Jamal accompanied her to synagogue. What made their friendship work, Terry said, was that they were willing to reach across a divide, question their assumptions, and learn about each other's politics and cultures to relinquish comfort zones. When Terry asked Jamal how it felt to be at her Ashkenazi synagogue, he replied, "The way you Jews pray is really different from how Muslims pray. But what we pray for is exactly the same."
So the strategy, again, of focusing on how Jews have resisted persecution and who's been allies to us and being allies to other people is part of the way of turning around those feelings of internalized victimization, of recovering, of healing. And the whole last third of the book focuses on healing strategies. Another one is reframing the toxic messages in our heads, like, I'm not loud, I'm passionate. There's a wonderful young Jewish spoken word artist, and she calls herself the Hebrew Mamita. I encourage you to Google her. Her name is Vanessa Hidary, and she does reframing in her rap. And one of the things she says is, "If you must see me as that blood-sucking Jew, see me as that pesky mosquito that bites and sucks the prejudice right out of you." And she goes on to say, "I will use my gift to only uplift and maybe change just one heart tonight. I'm the non-conspiracizing, always questioning, hip-hop listening, Torah scroll reading, all people loving, pride-filled Jewish girl." And then there's a whole chapter called Liberatory Healing, and that's really where we bring our bodies into the act. It's really about healing trauma and rebuilding aliveness. And this is one story from that chapter.
In her Yom Kippur sermon, high school senior Natalie Boskin described how dancing keeps grief from sucking the joy out of her life. She lost a number of her family members and friends. She understood that sitting Shiva was only the first step in coping with her pain. "My body craves dance," she said. "I need my body, lungs, brain, and heart to feel that electricity, reminding me that I'm still here. Then, by getting the emotions into my web of muscles, I can get the space to understand them." After one funeral, she drove straight to her dance studio. "I start to move. The grief is replaced by rhythm of the drums. The movement starts to fill me up like water fills up a balloon, pushing the grief out. By no means am I trying to deny myself feeling loss. In the face of death, this process simply allows me to feel the radical joy of passion and life. The goal is to feel what you need to feel. The goal is to feel what you need to feel as deeply as you can allow, and then feel alive when the joy comes back."
So just to reemphasize, a key theme of this book is that uprooting internalized oppression can exponentially expand the possibilities, the sense of possibilities that we have with our lives, and really profoundly empower a practice of social justice. Sometimes I call it activism as therapy.
April 2002, when the Israeli army invades Jenin refugee camp, in 2 days we organized a Jewish Voice for Peace civil disobedience action and public protest at San Francisco's Israeli consulate. Hundreds gather for the demo. The mood is outraged, but also upbeat, warm, connected, and visibly Jewish. We alternate anti-occupation chants with Israeli peace songs. After we shut down the consulate, then block the street, the police arrest us. Henry cries, "We call on all Jews, speak up in your synagogues. Every Jew who is holding back for fear of hurting Israel is hurting Israel." As we are led to the police van, I remember the thank you in people's eyes. I realize how important it is in heart-wrenching times to create moments where we can feel our power, make a difference, feel connected to each other in our mutual hunger for justice. Activism as therapy.
Heartsick from the 2008-2009 three-week Israeli attack on Gaza, many Jewish activists began responding to the 2005 Palestinian call for a nonviolent human rights movement to end Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians, including boycotts, including divestment from companies that profit from the occupation, what they call BDS, or boycotts, divestment, sanctions. These actions are about targeting injustice, Israel's occupation, and pressuring Israel to abide by international law. Rabbi Rebecca Alpert points out, we in the American Jewish community can't turn our backs on a Palestinian movement that uses the nonviolence of boycott, divestment, and sanctions to work for peace. Rather, we must do everything in our power to raise Jewish voices, rabbinic voices, and proclaim our solidarity. And then this is my voice again. And yes, these tactics can contribute sometimes to Jews feeling under siege, but we can't give in to those feelings. We can't wait to act until we've healed all our wounds. Despite countless diplomatic efforts and activist campaigns, the peace process has only slid backwards. Palestinians and Israelis need a just peace now. And hopefully these campaigns will boost that process by bringing economic and ethical pressure to bear to change behavior, like the boycotts of Montgomery, Alabama buses or California table grapes. This is what the US civil rights and women's and gay liberation movements were all about as well, nonviolently ending injustice. Rabbi Margaret Holub wrote, I've dedicated my life work to helping the Jewish people grow and blossom. I believe that occupying another people has wounded our people at the root of our collective soul. I see in boycott, divestment, and sanctions the hope for healing. Most importantly for the Palestinians, whose homes, livelihoods, and lives are harmed, but also for our own Jewish people. I take great hope in the Jewish people and our capacity to do good. And then the book ends with a whole chapter about activism, focusing on what different Jewish groups are doing locally and nationally, from working for food justice to a domestic workers' bill of rights, from empowering battered women and children and raising trans Jewish voices, from Jewish fair trade to Jewish youth for community action, to raising Jewish voices for Palestinian human rights.
Let's remember the connections between our own immigrant past and those trying to slip across US borders to escape grinding poverty. The connections between today's racial profiling and our own histories, between pogroms or forced exile and current immigration deportations by ICE, wrenching apart families, between coerced service in the SARS army and the recruitment of young people of color to fight US wars when no other jobs can be found, much less affordable education, between our own exodus from tyranny in Egypt and liberation struggles the world over. Our security as US Jews lies in our relationships with our allies and with each other, our hope in what we can create together. Using our privilege to shift power, let's tackle dehumanization and midwife social justice, creating solidarity that is accountable, resilient, and shot through with great swaths of love.
There's a new Jewish identity, says activist leader Cecily Saraski, one that's multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-sexual, a united front against bigotry and nationalism, and for all forms of equality. So Jewish liberation simultaneously includes speaking out against anti-Semitism, like conspiracy theories, stereotypes, hate crimes, Christian Zionism, and it also includes working for a better world for everyone. And then Jewish liberation also includes valuing our Jewish selves, intertwining healthy self-love with social justice. Whether we're intervening against police brutality, or against the Keystone XL pipeline, or fighting the Israeli seizure of Palestinian land, or transphobia, or the rollback of abortion rights.
At Occupy Wall Street, Naomi Klein noted her favorite sign, I care about you. Let's treat each other, she says, as if we plan to work side by side in struggle for many years to come. Also remembering it is in relationship with each other that minds and hearts can change.
So I just have two short pieces I'm going to end with. I just really wanted to thank you for your attention and hope you have some questions or comments or ideas we can bat around. If you do want to buy a book, Lauren can sell one to you. And also to encourage you, at the end of the book, it's a 38-page action-oriented reader's guide that you might, if anything that I've talked about today has resonated for you or has been interesting, you might want to form your own group just to go through that action guide, and it helps you go through the chapters. And I think you would, you would learn a lot about your own struggles and identities and do some learning together in your group. So these are the two pieces I want to end with. This is written by the youth wing of Jewish Voice for Peace. We are punks and students and parents and janitors and rabbis and freedom fighters. We remember brave, desperate resistance. We remember the labor movement. We remember the camps. We remember solidarity as a means of survival and an act of affirmation, and we are proud. We refuse to knowingly oppress others, and we refuse to oppress each other. We will not carry the legacy of terror. We won't buy the logic that slaughter means safety. We commit to equality, solidarity, and integrity. We seek breathing room and dignity for all people. And then this is what I wrote at the end of the book's introduction, and it's my dedication to the book. Dedicating these pages to those who resisted in whatever ways they did, sneaking through holes in ghetto walls, stealing food, organizing, leaping off trains, burying what's precious, encouraging others, dynamite in their fingernails, singing. These are my people. Thank you. Anything you related to, or yes, Sarah?
When you were talking about internalization, I feel like a common thing that I'm a pretty strong feminist, and I think that a really common concept of internalization is internalized misogyny, at least that I see on the daily, is when girls say, I don't hang out with other girls, I only hang out with boys because girls are fun. And I just thought growing up, I was like, that's just a thing girls say. And recently I realized that that's really internalized misogyny. And I feel like
It's a great example. I mean, it's horrible, but yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I wonder where that comes from. We're not born that way. Somewhere that idea gets planted in us, and this is from the society. And it keeps us from each other. It can keep us from being close, friends, whatever. Yeah, Oren?
The part of the title of the book is choosing justice despite our fears. And I see in lots of communities where people are living on the margins or where dissent emerges, there are fears of responses from one's own community. I'm curious to know what other Jews, either mainstream Jewish communities or more marginal Jewish communities, have responded to the work you do as an activist, and how they've responded to what you've written in this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's a good question. I've spoken at synagogues all over the country, from Cleveland, Brooklyn, LA, Ann Arbor, Madison, Olympia, Oakland. And these are mostly either Reform or Reconstructionists, so that means they were on the more liberal end. But any synagogue usually has a diversity of people. And there's been a diversity of opinion. To me, the point is it's fine, it's great to have a diversity of opinion. The point is to respectfully listen to each other and not try to beat each other up or tear each other down. I was thinking of in Olympia especially, there were about 60 people, and they really ran across the spectrum, and they seemed to really appreciate being able to be in the same room and talk about some of these things together. And actually, I don't know if you all are familiar with what Hillel is, but it's a Jewish organization that's on campus, a lot of campuses. And next month in Boston, there's going to be an open Hillel conference because the Hillel organization has guidelines for the student Hillel saying you can't invite these people. You can't invite speakers who are criticizing Israel, things like that. And the open Hillel folks are saying, wait a minute, we're here as students to be critical thinkers. We're here to learn. We want to be able to invite whoever we want to invite, no matter how right-wing or left-wing or middle that they are. And that should be our self-determination. And they're really forming this whole movement to do that. And I think that's really exciting. So that is one way to respond to your question. I remember, I don't know if any of you have heard of Edward Said, who's a wonderful Palestinian intellectual who died a few years ago. He's pretty famous. And he said, I remember this quote because it really stuck with me. He said, universities are not the place to solve problems, but they're the place to exchange ideas. So, Letitia, yeah.
Well, I'm interested in this action plan, which I'll purchase the book at some point, but because I appreciate how you talk about even if we have fears, we don't have to be controlled by our fears. We can still move forward. There's a lot of things I related to being a Black woman, discrimination, oppression, and I would love to start something for Black women of color, who, I have, even on campus, people have made racist remarks towards Black people, so I don't know, I think I'm racially ambiguous, people don't know what I am, so they just, but it's still very painful, and I don't, how you were saying, like, take the Egypt out of even not being defined by the Holocaust, not being defined by slavery, that psychological, hatred of yourself. And so I think I appreciate you sharing, because in order for you to write this book, in order for you to share these things, shows how much work you did on yourself, inside yourself, internally, a lot of hard work. So I really respect that, and I really want to get there too, so I can also help other women as well. So
Thank you for that. In my study group was an African-American friend who was doing her dissertation on internalized racism. And we found a lot, there are commonalities and there are a lot of differences. But she related a lot too, and in fact, I'm glad to give you my card, and I have two different friends. In my graduate program, I got to be in a study group with 4 African-American women, and we were called 4 Dreads and a Jew. They came up with the name, because I wanted to learn from a non-Eurocentric learning perspective. And 2 of them wrote their dissertations on internalized racism. I think you'd find them really interesting. They're different, but and I could just give you their emails, because there is a lot happening. But that was really transformative for me, because we're in the group and I'm listening. I'm thinking, I want to learn more about racism. And at one point they said, Penny, we're not hearing from you. What about, your Jewish story? And they said, and I said, well, I want to learn from you. And they said, the best way you can be an ally to us is to feel good about who you are. And that's because they said, if you're trying to pull out of us reassurance for your being a good person, we don't want that. You do your work, and that is really started me on this. So it's all connected. My internalized anti-Semitism came out of my doctoral cohort experience of working very deeply around racism between the students who were white, including Jews, and the students of color at that point who were all African American. So it's connected to what you're talking about, and continues to be. One of them, her dissertation, Bola's dissertation, is how it's an ongoing practice. It's not like okay, this is a problem, I'm gonna fix it, now I'm healed, right? No, it's like, but I'm so sorry that, about the racism that's coming at you. And I really I'm committed to, as a white person, working to change that. Yes, Sarah.
There's a place on the UC 3rd floor for
nationality and ethnic center, and the other half is gender and sexuality. You can come hang out with me. It's
Awesome.
cool. I hang out there a lot, I eat lunch. We talk about stuff sometimes.
Great. Yeah.
Recently, with Israel-Palestine, Israel is expanding 1,000 acres into the West Bank, and that's drawn heavy criticism from the UK and the US. I just want to know what you think, if that will affect US relations with Israel or at all.
Don't get me started. For those of you who don't know, so he's talking about the settlements, and the settlements, they're like colonies. They're like, in the land, the UN divided the land and said this part belongs to Palestinians, this part belongs to Israelis. There are people on both sides who want all of the land for themselves. But the settlements is often called one of the biggest obstacles to peace, because it's Jewish neighborhoods in the middle of Palestinian land. It'd like be in the middle of, here you are on campus, and some other group comes in and starts developing their own neighborhood. And one of the things that's really hard about it is not only are they using Palestinian land, but for example, they have water and they have swimming pools and they have beautiful lawns, and in the village next door, the Palestinians don't have enough water to drink. So there's a real system of separation and discrimination. That is there's some ways it's comparable to racism in this country in terms of more affluent white communities being next to poor black communities and who gets the resources. So that's what he's talking about. And so after this horrific assault on Gaza, and after 5 weeks, there was finally a ceasefire. And then the Israeli government says, oh yeah, by the way, we're making 1,000 acres, which is a huge amount of area. We're going to start a whole new settlement. So to me, that does not sound like a country that is wanting peace. That's like almost like provocation, like look what we're going to do. And I just find it horrifying and deeply painful, especially because our government often says the settlements are wrong, they shouldn't be there, but they don't do anything. They don't do anything to stop it. And this government, I think, could just say, we're going to stop giving you money until you end the occupation and end the siege of Gaza, and let Palestinians have their own self-determination, because that's where our tax dollars are going. So I don't think it's not anti-Israel, that's pro-human rights. So thanks for bringing that up. Yes?
Do you find that when you're going around and giving these talks that a lot of people are they ready to accept the message of what's going on in Palestine as a anti-human rights issue, or a human rights issue versus a Jewish versus non-Jewish issue, or is it more, is it still like?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I would like to hope so. I think one of the problems is the media. The media casts it as you're either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, which I hate. It's like, oh, you can't be pro both peoples? You can't support Israeli people and Palestinian people and say, no, I'm pro-peace and justice, and I'm anti-occupation. I'm anti-war and violence, and I'm pro-human rights. To me, that's the distinction. And so that's one way to respond to your question. I just wish the media did a better job, quit polarizing things, because then it teaches people to think it in that way. That's also why universities are important, and kind of teaching that Oren does is important in terms of looking at nuance and complexity. And there was another question over here. Somebody, yes?
So I'm really interested. Your book, it seems, has a lot of information from the perspective of queer people and women and trans people. Have you heard any different responses from male-identified folks? And have you found that there's any difference in how internalized anti-Semitism works among male-identified people, or have they had any different comments or responses to your book?
Yeah, that's another great question. Do you all know who Naomi Klein is? Are you familiar with her? She's actually going to be in Berkeley on the 29th of September. She has a new book out about climate change. But I was doing an event in Vancouver, and her mother organized the event for me. And Naomi's mother and father were some of the readers. And in the middle of the whole thing, her father, Michael, turns to me and says, Jewish men feel the same way. He was feeling like a lot of what I was talking about applied. He was relating to a lot of it. And I've heard this from some other men as well, including non-Jewish men. I don't know if there's any male-identified folks here who want to respond if anything I talked about, you related to. But that's the best that because I didn't really study. I mean, I was definitely studying Jews and including Jewish men, but I was really focused on the women a lot because so much gets focused on the men. I thought I want to focus on the women and trans folks. So if there are any men that want to respond to that, not to put you on the spot, or male-identified people, feel free. You're invited to. Yes.
First of all, I want to say I'm a big JVP fan, so I know everything that goes on with the org. My question is, with the divestment of the Presbyterian Church against, taking $21 million, or divesting $21 million from IBM for the occupation and the suffering of Palestinians, how do you, how do you solve that obstacle or do that, or to spread that type of, how can I say this, influence to evangelical Christian Zionists who make up 70 million votes in the United States in support of Israel? So, that was my question. How do you change those minds?
Yeah.
Is it a bigger thing?
Yeah, I don't think they're going to be our target. And of course, it's not just right-wing evangelical Christians, it's right-wing Muslims and right-wing Jews and right-wing whatever. But I'm glad you brought up what you were talking about. At the end, I talked about BDS, and that's one of the hopeful signs, is that's a big movement in this country that was called for all Palestinians, and a lot of it is on college campuses. Around here, UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, different ones. And that's really hopeful. And so what you were referring to, that was also the Presbyterian Church, which is the largest Christian denomination in this country. For 10 years, they brought up the idea of, again, we're not against Israel, we're divesting from companies that are profiting from the occupation. One was Caterpillar, which makes the bulldozers. You think, oh, that just plows up people's, a farm. No, the ones that they send to Israel are weaponized, and they have gun turrets, and they destroy homes. And they ran over Rachel Corrie, who was a 23-year-old college student from Olympia, Washington, and killed her. Divesting from Hewlett-Packard, right here in Palo Alto, who, they make the nice equipment, but they also make equipment that the Israeli military uses at checkpoints to harass Palestinians. And then the other one that they're divesting from that the Presbyterians did is Motorola. And Motorola makes surveillance equipment that's used by the Israeli settlers. So the point that the divestment is saying, you're not following human rights, your companies are supporting this occupation, so we want to take our money away from you until you follow human rights. So it's a nonviolent thing. And so this campaign by the Presbyterians they've been trying to do this for 10 years, and finally, with the help of groups like Jewish Voice for Peace and other interfaith groups, they voted in June, and by 7 votes, this divestment won. So this was one of the biggest victories that's happened. And it's as difficult as this battle is, it's one of the very hopeful signs that their group this big and this influential has said, no, we're following this nonviolent strategy of economic and ethical pressure to end injustice. And it was somewhat based on the model that ended apartheid in South Africa in, 1984, something like that. That was a 30-year struggle, and people there thought it would never end. And divestment really helped shift public opinion and took a lot of money away from the South African corporations. And so the balance of power changed. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up. And again, there is literature here from Jewish Voice for Peace if you're interested. Anyone else? Yeah, Sarah.
Talking about your book revolving around women and queer women and trans women. When I was thinking about it, I studied a lot of gender and sexuality. And when I think about it, not saying that men don't face injustice, but women face women and queer women and women, transgender women and transsexual women face so much injustice every day that I feel like sometimes we might have a better grasp of injustice. Not saying that other people can't grasp the subject, but they may not understand it in the same way that someone who's faced injustice on a daily basis would understand the concept of injustice. So talking to women, trans women, queer women about this concept in another way, I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's just like, I think the closer we are to oppression, there's a way that we're able to hold on to our humanity and we see injustice more. I mean, I just know, again, as a white person, I'm never gonna know what it's like to be targeted by racism 24/7. But I can work to like become aware through my friends of color and become as aware as I can, but I'm never gonna know in that, I'm never gonna feel it in the same way, or as in, I guess I was gonna use the example of disability, but a lot of us over time become disabled if we didn't start out that way, so that one may be a little different, but I agree with you, I mean, I also believe in an oppressive society, everyone's oppressed. There are ways in this society that no matter how much privilege you are, there are ways that you can be oppressed by it, but it's also looking at who has the institutional power, and it's, you know, white, Christian, male, and again, this is not looking at individual people, this is looking at a system of oppression. It's not to say any individual is bad, but just to look how power shakes out. Anyone else? Yes.
So how do you think, sort of, how would you relate your pro-Palestinian activism to, say, Haredi, anti-Zionism, like Mizrahi Karta?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the reference is. Can you clarify your question? There's something I'm not understanding about it.
So in very Orthodox Jewish peoples, there's sometimes a very strong anti-Israel sentiment. Do you believe that Israel is secular? And do you think there's like, I guess you're saying that you're not anti-Israel, you're pro-Israel and pro-Palestine.
Yeah, I wasn't really, yeah, that's what I was saying. I don't really like that binary of pro-Palestine or Israel or anti, yeah, but I think you were asking something more than that, right?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of pro-Palestinian Jewish activism isn't from the Haredi world.
And that's the word, you know, I've heard it, but I'm not remembering what it is. Can you define it for us or explain it?
It's like very Orthodox.
So you're saying, your comment is, or question is that a lot of the activism and the occupation isn't from the Haredi, the very Orthodox world?
Well, I mean, there is like a contingent of Haredi, I guess, anti-Israel activism, but I feel like it's sort of separate from this more like reform and reconstructionist pro-Palestinian activism. And so I was wondering, like, do you think that those two groups can work together, or?
Which two groups? I'm sorry, I'm not quite.
The ultra-Orthodox
Yeah.
Jewish and Reform or Reconstructionist
Oh.
secular Jewish groups.
Geez, I mean, I don't know. What do you think, Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, I think if the idea, right, is to build alliances across differences, which is what you're trying to do, then I don't see any reason why, using the framework that you're using, those groups can't work together if, you know, they have shared ideas, shared identities, shared oppressions, various ways of working together. I think there can be alliances that could be built. That response?
If you know, if you can have the perspective of all people deserve justice, so that's broad, but that's really kind of, I think, where it's at, and human rights.
Time for one last question. If there is one. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you very much.